New Orleans, 2003. A bride vanished from the back of the church just minutes before she was to walk down the aisle. The police, quick to judge, labeled her a runaway with cold feet. For 6 agonizing months, her mother and fiancé fought to find the truth, never knowing that her abductor, disguised as the wedding videographer, had been sitting among them the entire time. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now let me tell you the story. The air in New Orleans on that brilliant October morning in 2003 was thick with the sweet, heavy perfume of magnolia blossoms and the electric promise of a perfect day. For 24-year-old Jasmine Carter, it was more than just a perfect day. It was the day, the one she had been meticulously, lovingly planning for the better part of a year. Her wedding day. Every detail, from the hand-tied jasmine bouquets that scented the church vestibule to the carefully chosen gospel choir whose voices were set to fill the rafters of the historic street. Louis Cathedral was a testament to her nature. She was a planner, a builder, a woman who found joy in creating beautiful, stable things in a world that was often chaotic. This innate desire to build and to heal was the driving force of her life. A recent graduate with a master's degree in social work, Jasmine possessed a deep, almost preternatural empathy, a quality that was balanced by a sharp, analytical mind. She was the person her friends came to for advice, the one who could see the heart of a problem and map out a sensible, compassionate solution. Her laughter was a frequent, infectious sound, a warm melody that seemed to invite everyone into its circle. The center of that circle, the unshakable foundation of her world, was Marcus Hayes. Theirs was not a whirlwind romance, but something far deeper and more enduring. They had been best friends since they were teenagers. Their love story a slow, beautiful burn built on a decade of shared secrets, inside jokes, and an unshakable, absolute trust. Marcus, a brilliant young architect who was already making a name for himself in the city, was her perfect counterpart. Where she was the empathetic heart, he was the logical mind, the man who could translate her dreams into blueprints. Their love was a quiet, powerful thing, a partnership so solid and so self-evident that to everyone who knew them, their marriage felt less like a beginning and more like a beautiful, inevitable continuation. Jasmine was not a woman with doubts. She was grounded, centered, and more certain of this step than any she had ever taken. As she stood in the bridal suite at the back of the cathedral, the heavy, antique lace of her wedding dress pooling around her, she felt a profound sense of peace. Through the tall, arched window, she could see the familiar, vibrant chaos of the French Quarter, the city that was the backdrop to her entire life. Today, she would marry the man she loved, surrounded by the community that had raised her, and begin the life she had so carefully and so hopefully planned. The day was perfect. The future was bright. The love was real. She was completely unaware that in the pews of the church, a man with a camera was watching her, his presence a dark, discordant note in the otherwise perfect symphony of her wedding day. The St. Louis Cathedral, a grand, historic monument to faith and endurance, was filled to capacity. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the pews in kaleidoscopic patterns of ruby and sapphire. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and the low, happy hum of 100 conversations. Family and friends, who had flown in from all over the country, turned in their seats, their faces a sea of expectant smiles, all directed towards the massive, ornate doors at the back of the sanctuary. In the bridal suite, the final, frantic preparations were underway. Jasmine's mother, Gloria Carter, a woman whose usual nurse's pragmatism had given way to a radiant maternal joy, adjusted her daughter's veil, her hands gentle, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that was a lifetime in the making. Jasmine felt a surge of pure, uncomplicated happiness. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. It was then that a soft, polite knock came at the door. One of the bridesmaids opened it to reveal a man in his late 30s, dressed in the nondescript, professional attire of a wedding vendor. He was holding a large, professional-grade video camera on his shoulder. It was Adrian Finch, the videographer they had hired. He was a quiet, almost forgettable man, someone they had booked based on a decent online portfolio and a reasonable price. He had been a phantom during the planning process, communicating only through brief, polite emails. He offered a small, apologetic smile. "I am so sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice a soft, respectful murmur. "But the light outside, just for the next few minutes, is absolutely perfect. It's that magical golden hour light. If I could just steal the bride away for 90 seconds, right by the side entrance, I can get a shot for the video that will look like something out of a movie. It would be an incredible opening for the wedding film." The request seemed entirely plausible, even professional. He was the artist, the expert, seeing an opportunity for a perfect shot. In the happy, slightly chaotic bubble of the bridal suite, no one questioned it. "Of course," Gloria said, beaming. "Whatever you need to get the best pictures for my baby. It will only take a moment, I promise," Adrian said, his gaze briefly meeting Jasmine's. There was an intensity in his eyes that was slightly unsettling, but she dismissed it as artistic passion. "We have to go right now before the light changes." Jasmine, caught up in the whirlwind of the moment and always a professional herself, nodded. "Okay, just for a minute." She gathered the heavy satin of her dress and followed him out of the suite and into a quiet, stone-paved side corridor of the cathedral. He led her towards a heavy, arched wooden door that opened onto a small, secluded alleyway that ran alongside the church. It was a place that was hidden from the view of the bustling street out front. "Just right here," he said, gesturing to a spot against the ancient, ivy-covered stone wall. "The way the light is hitting the stone, it's just magnificent. Just stand right there and look back towards the door, like you're waiting for the ceremony to begin." Jasmine did as she was told, turning her back to him, arranging her dress, a happy, expectant smile on her face for the camera she assumed was now pointed at her. The shot would be beautiful. She could already imagine it, the opening scene of the video that would be the story of the best day of her life. She waited. 1 second, 2 seconds. She waited for the sound of the camera whirring, for his direction to hold the pose. But there was only silence. A silence that was suddenly punctuated by the sound of a heavy metallic click behind her. The sound of the alley door being locked from the inside. She turned around, her smile faltering, a sudden, cold premonition washing over her. Adrian Finch was no longer holding the camera. He was standing a few feet away, and in his hand was not a lens, but a small, black object she recognized from her criminal justice textbooks. It was a taser. The polite, professional videographer was gone. In his place was a stranger, his face a mask of calm, triumphant, and terrifying obsession. The perfect day had just been plunged into a nightmare. Inside the grand, sun-drenched sanctuary of St. Louis Cathedral, the organist, taking her cue from the wedding planner, drew a deep breath and began to play. The opening chords of the bridal march, a powerful, soaring melody, filled the vast space, and a reverent hush fell over the assembled guests. Every head in the cathedral turned towards the massive, ornate doors at the back, their faces a beautiful, collective portrait of joyful anticipation. At the altar, Marcus Hayes stood, his heart a wild, happy drum against his ribs. He was a man who lived his life in a world of blueprints and precise angles, a world of logic and order. But the emotion that seized him in that moment was pure, transcendent, and gloriously illogical. He was about to marry the woman who was both the anchor and the adventure of his life. He fixed his gaze on the closed doors, a wide, boyish grin spreading across his face, waiting for the moment they would swing open and reveal his future. The music swelled, the familiar, beloved melody reaching its crescendo, the point where the doors were meant to part, where his bride was meant to appear. But the doors remained shut. The music continued, the organist holding the final, expectant chord for a few, long, awkward seconds. The chord hung in the air, and then, with a hesitant, questioning uncertainty, it faded into silence. A confused, uneasy murmur rippled through the pews. Guests turned to each other, their smiles faltering, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. Marcus's own smile froze on his face. He looked at his best man, who could only offer a shrug of bafflement. He looked out at the sea of faces and saw his own confusion mirrored back at him. His heart, which had been pounding with joy just moments before, now began to pound with a different, colder rhythm. At the back of the church, in the vestibule, chaos was erupting. Gloria Carter, who had been waiting to follow her daughter down the aisle, was in a state of frantic, disbelieving panic. "Where is she?" she demanded of the wedding planner, her voice a sharp, high-pitched cry. The music played. "Where is Jasmine?" The wedding planner, her face pale, her professional composure shattering, could only shake her head. The bridesmaids, a panicked flurry of pastel silk, were searching the bridal suite, the bathrooms, the corridors, their calls of "Jasmine, Jasmine," growing more and more desperate. The videographer, Adrian Finch, stood quietly in a corner of the vestibule, his camera on his shoulder, filming the unfolding scene with a calm, detached professionalism. He was just another vendor, caught up in the sudden, inexplicable drama. Marcus, unable to stand the uncertainty any longer, broke from his position at the altar and strode down the long aisle, his long, confident steps now a frantic, hurried pace. He reached the back of the church to find a scene of pure, escalating panic. "What's going on?" he demanded, his voice tight with a fear that was so new and so absolute it was paralyzing. "We can't find her," Gloria sobbed, her hand clutching at his arm. "She was here. She was right here. She just stepped out with the video guy for a picture, and now she's gone." The words hung in the air, a nonsensical, impossible explanation. Marcus, Gloria, and the wedding party searched every inch of the cathedral and the small, manicured grounds surrounding it, but there was no sign of her. Her purse was still in the bridal suite. Her street clothes were still hanging in the closet. The only thing missing was Jasmine herself, in her beautiful antique lace wedding dress. It was as if she had simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind only the ghost of a perfect day and a church filled with a terrible, unanswered silence. The arrival of the New Orleans Police Department transformed the sacred, joyful space of the cathedral into a crime scene. The wedding guests, their initial confusion having curdled into a state of shocked, horrified disbelief, were asked to remain in the pews, their festive attire a grotesque, surreal counterpoint to the grim, methodical work of the investigators. The case landed on the desk of Detective Ben Holloway, a veteran of the NOPD's Homicide Division, a man whose weary, cynical outlook had been forged in the crucible of a city that had one of the highest murder rates in the nation. He arrived at the cathedral, his face a mask of tired, professional impassivity, and surveyed the scene. A missing bride, a distraught groom, a hysterical mother. He had seen this scenario, or variations of it, a dozen times before. His mind, conditioned by years of experience and the grim, unassailable logic of statistics, immediately defaulted to the most likely explanation: cold feet. It was the Occam's razor of a domestic disappearance. The simplest explanation was almost always the correct one. A young woman, on the precipice of a life-altering commitment, had a last-minute panic attack and had simply walked away. His initial interview with Gloria Carter did little to dissuade him of this theory. He saw a mother in denial, a woman whose idealized image of her daughter was preventing her from seeing the obvious truth. He listened with a practiced, detached sympathy as she insisted that Jasmine was not the type, that she would never do this, that something terrible must have happened. "Ma'am, I understand this is difficult," he said, his voice a low, placating rumble. "But you have to understand, 99% of the time in a situation like this, the person has left voluntarily. We will file a report, but she is a 24-year-old adult. There is no evidence of foul play here." His conversation with Marcus Hayes, the groom, only served to harden his initial suspicion. He saw a young, handsome, successful man who seemed, to his cynical eye, a little too perfect, a little too composed in the face of the chaos. He subjected Marcus to a series of sharp, probing questions, his tone subtly shifting from that of an investigator to that of an interrogator. Had they argued? Were there financial problems? Was there another woman? Marcus, his mind still reeling from the shock and the dawning, terrifying horror of the situation, answered the questions with a stunned, almost robotic calm. This composure, born of shock, was misinterpreted by Holloway as a sign of coldness, of a lack of genuine emotion. The seed of a new, darker narrative began to form in the detective's mind. Maybe it wasn't just cold feet. Maybe there had been a fight. Maybe the distraught groom was not as innocent as he appeared. He interviewed the last people to see her, the bridesmaids, who told him about the videographer and his request for an urgent bridal shoot. He spoke to the videographer himself. Adrian Finch was a picture of professional sympathy. He explained, in his quiet, soft-spoken way, that he had taken the bride outside for a quick shot, that she had seemed happy and excited. He claimed that after the shot, she had said she needed a moment to herself and had walked a little ways down the alley. He had assumed she was just collecting her thoughts before the big moment. He had packed up his gear and, seeing the chaos begin to unfold, had quietly left through a side door, not wanting to be in the way. It was a plausible, professional, and entirely believable story. Detective Holloway, his investigation guided by the powerful, blinding force of his own preconceived notions, had found his narrative. The bride had gotten cold feet. She had used the excuse of the photo shoot to slip away, and the groom, the jilted and possibly angry groom, was the most likely person to know where she had gone. The official investigation, in its first, most critical hours, had not just failed to see the truth, it had actively and decisively turned its back on it. The world Jasmine woke to was a world of metal, dust, and a profound, suffocating silence. The first thing she registered was the dull, throbbing ache in her head and the unfamiliar, lumpy texture of a thin mattress beneath her. The air was stale, thick with the smell of rust and old, damp earth. For a disoriented, terrifying moment, she had no idea where she was. Then, the memory of the alleyway, of the man who was not a videographer, of the sudden, electric jolt of the taser, came crashing back. She sat up, her heart a frantic, panicked bird in her chest, and took in her surroundings. She was in a trailer, a small, cramped, and filthy travel trailer, the kind that was meant for weekend camping trips, not for a permanent, human cage. The windows were covered from the outside with sheets of crudely bolted-on plywood, plunging the interior into a perpetual, dusty twilight. The only light came from a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. A heavy, industrial-style padlock was on the inside of the main door, a chilling and clear message that she was not a guest. Her wedding dress, the beautiful, antique lace gown that had been the symbol of her perfect day, was now a soiled, tragic costume. It was a cruel, tangible reminder of the life that had been so violently, and so completely, stolen from her just hours before. The initial wave of pure, animalistic terror was so powerful it was paralyzing. She was trapped. She was at the mercy of a man who was clearly, dangerously, and obsessively insane. But as the first shock began to recede, it was replaced by something else, something harder, colder, and far more useful. It was the social worker in her, the planner, the problem solver. Her mind, which had been a chaotic storm of fear, began to clear. Panic, she knew, was a luxury she could not afford. Survival depended on a clear, rational assessment of the situation. She began to take a mental inventory of her prison. A small kitchenette with a non-functional stove, a tiny, disgusting bathroom, a built-in dinette with cracked vinyl cushions, and the bed she was on, at the very back of the trailer. And then she began to take an inventory of her captor. When Adrian Finch finally entered the trailer hours later, he was no longer the quiet, unassuming videographer. He was a man transformed, his eyes alight with a triumphant proprietary gleam. He was not acting like a kidnapper. He was acting like a groom who had finally come to claim his rightful bride. He had brought her a pathetic offering, a wilted bouquet of gas station flowers and a box of stale pastries. "I told you I would save you," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper, as if they were sharing a secret. "You don't belong with him, Jasmine. You belong with me. I've always known that." In that moment, Jasmine understood the true, horrifying nature of her situation. This was not a random act of violence. This was the culmination of a long, silent, and deeply personal obsession. This man, this stranger, had been watching her. He had constructed an entire, delusional fantasy around her, and he had now made that fantasy her reality. Her social work training, the years she had spent learning to de-escalate volatile situations, to understand the fractured logic of a disturbed mind, kicked in. She knew that to fight him physically would be futile. To scream, to defy him openly, would only provoke his rage. Her only weapon was her mind. She made a strategic, life-or-death decision. She would play along. She would enter his delusion, not as a believer, but as a student. She would learn the rules of his twisted world. She would study his psychology, his triggers, his weaknesses. She would become the most compliant, the most understanding, the most perfect captive. She would lull him into a false sense of security, a belief that he had not just captured her body, but that he had won her heart. And she would wait. She would wait for the one, single, inevitable mistake that would give her the chance to escape. The wedding day was over. The war for her survival had just begun. Adrian Finch was a man who lived a life of meticulous, almost invisible precision. In the weeks following the abduction, he returned to his small, anonymous apartment in a quiet New Orleans suburb and resumed his life as if nothing had happened. He continued to book small, freelance videography jobs. He paid his bills on time. He was, to the handful of people who knew him, the same quiet, solitary, and slightly awkward man he had always been. His performance was a masterpiece of sociopathic control. A few days after the wedding, he called Gloria Carter. His voice, over the phone, was a perfect symphony of professional sympathy and shared grief. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his tone hushed and respectful. "This is Adrian Finch, the videographer from the wedding. I can't stop thinking about what happened. It was supposed to be such a beautiful day. I am just so sorry for what you and your family are going through." He explained that he had already edited the footage he had shot before the bride's unfortunate departure. He told her it contained some beautiful, happy moments of Jasmine in the bridal suite, of the guests arriving. He offered to turn it all over to the police, free of charge, in case it could help with their investigation. It was an act of such audacious, chilling arrogance that it was almost brilliant. He was not just hiding from the investigation, he was actively participating in it, positioning himself as a helpful, heartbroken vendor. He was hiding in plain sight, his camera a shield, his professional title the perfect alibi. He watched the news reports with a kind of detached, academic interest. He saw the stories about the runaway bride, the speculation about a secret lover, the subtle, and then not-so-subtle finger-pointing at the jilted groom, Marcus Hayes. Each report that reinforced the false narrative was a small, private victory for him. He had not just stolen a woman, he had stolen her story, and he had rewritten it to his own, twisted specifications. He lived for the moments when he could escape his mundane, solitary life and drive the 2 hours to the desolate, rural lot outside of Baton Rouge where he kept the trailer. That was his real life. The trailer was his kingdom, his secret, perfect world. A place where the delusional fantasy he had nurtured for years was now a living, breathing reality. His obsession with Jasmine had started years earlier. She had been a college student working a part-time job at a coffee shop he frequented. He had been just another anonymous customer, a quiet man who would sit in a corner for hours, watching her. He had learned her name, her schedule, her dreams. He had followed her, both in person and later, online. He had constructed an entire, elaborate narrative in which they were destined to be together, in which her life with Marcus was a temporary, tragic mistake from which he was destined to rescue her. In his mind, he was not a captor. He was a hero. He was a romantic figure from a movie, a man who had taken extreme measures in the name of a love that was pure, absolute, and, in his mind, entirely reciprocated. He saw Jasmine's fear not as terror, but as a temporary, understandable confusion. He believed that in time, she would come to see the truth. She would come to understand that he was her savior, that this small, locked trailer was not a prison, but a sanctuary, a place where their true life together could finally begin. This profound, unshakable delusion was the source of his confidence. It was what allowed him to sit in that church, to film the pain he was causing, and to feel not guilt, but a sense of triumphant, righteous satisfaction. For Gloria Carter, the weeks following her daughter's disappearance were a descent into a special kind of hell, a place where grief and rage were locked in a constant, suffocating embrace. The police's official narrative, the lazy, insulting theory of a runaway bride, was a daily torment, a public denial of the daughter she knew. She knew Jasmine. She knew her heart, her mind, her soul. And she knew, with the unshakable, primal certainty of a mother, that her daughter had not run. She had been taken. Her grief, as profound as it was, became a source of fuel. It was a hot, righteous anger that burned away the tears and the despair, leaving behind a core of pure, unalloyed resolve. If the police were not going to fight for her daughter, then she would. Gloria Carter, the quiet, pragmatic nurse, transformed into a relentless, one-woman army. Her first battle was with the media. She refused to let them control the story. She called every local news station, every newspaper, every radio host in the city. At first, they were only interested in the salacious, human interest angle of the jilted bride. But Gloria, with her fierce, articulate, and unwavering conviction, forced them to listen. "My daughter is not a headline," she said during one raw, powerful on-camera interview, her voice trembling but her gaze as steady as steel. "She is a person. She is a social worker who has dedicated her life to helping others. She was in love. She was happy. She did not run away. Someone took her from me, and I am not going to rest until I find her." Her words, so full of a mother's pain and a mother's certainty, resonated with the public. The narrative began to shift. The story was no longer just about a missing bride. It was about a mother's desperate, heroic fight for justice. She used the newfound media attention as a tool. She organized search parties, enlisting the help of her church community, her colleagues from the hospital, and a growing army of strangers who had been moved by her story. They printed thousands of flyers, the smiling, joyful face of Jasmine in her wedding dress, a haunting, ubiquitous presence on the telephone poles and shop windows of New Orleans. She held weekly vigils on the steps of the St. Louis Cathedral, the scene of the crime. She stood with a single, flickering candle, her presence a silent, powerful accusation against a city and a police force that she felt had abandoned her daughter. Her war was not just a public one. It was a private, daily grind. She spent her nights, after her long shifts at the hospital, poring over wedding guest lists, vendor contracts, anything that could offer a clue. She became a detective in her own right, her investigation fueled by a mother's love, a force far more powerful than any official police procedure. She was a constant, nagging presence at the police precinct, a thorn in the side of a system that just wanted her to quietly go away. She would show up at Detective Holloway's desk, unannounced, with a new theory, a new piece of information she had gleaned from a conversation with one of Jasmine's friends. Holloway and the other detectives saw her as a nuisance, a grieving woman who was channeling her pain into a desperate amateur investigation. But they underestimated her. They underestimated the power of a mother who had nothing left to lose. Gloria Carter was not just fighting for her daughter's memory. She was fighting for her life, and she was a warrior who would not, could not, be defeated. While Gloria Carter fought a public war for the truth, Marcus Hayes was fighting a silent, private battle for his own survival. In the space of a single, unbelievable afternoon, he had gone from being the happiest man in New Orleans to its most tragic and most suspected figure. The whispers followed him everywhere, a corrosive, invisible poison that seeped into every corner of his life. At the grocery store, in the coffee shop, at the gas station, he would see the looks. The mixture of pity and a dark, speculative curiosity. He would hear the sudden hushed silences when he walked into a room. He was the jilted groom, the man the bride had run away from. And in the minds of many, a darker suspicion lingered. Maybe she hadn't run. Maybe he had done something to her. His career, which had been on a meteoric rise, stalled and then began to crumble. He was a partner in a small, prestigious architecture firm, a job that relied on trust, on reputation, on the delicate personal relationships he built with his clients. But who wanted to entrust the design of their dream home to a man whose own life had become a public nightmare? The calls stopped coming in. His partners, though outwardly supportive, began to distance themselves, their conversations strained and formal. He could see the doubt in their eyes. Even his own family, his own friends, were not immune to the poison. They would offer words of support, but he could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. They would ask, with a feigned casualness, If he and Jasmine had been fighting, if there had been any problems he hadn't told them about. They were trying to make sense of the senseless, and in their search for a logical explanation, he had become the most logical and most convenient target. His only true ally, the only other person in the world who seemed to share his absolute, unwavering faith in Jasmine's innocence, was her mother, Gloria. They became a strange, tragic, and deeply bonded team. They would spend hours together in Gloria's small, quiet living room, the air thick with their shared grief, poring over the same scant pieces of information, searching for a clue that the police had missed. The police, and Detective Holloway in particular, treated him not as a grieving partner, but as their one and only person of interest. He was subjected to hours of grueling, repetitive interviews, his every word, his every gesture, scrutinized for any sign of deception. They searched his apartment, his car, his office. They subpoenaed his phone records, his bank statements. They were not looking for a kidnapper. They were trying to build a case against him. Through it all, Marcus's loyalty to Jasmine never wavered for a single solitary second. The public suspicion, the loss of his career, the doubt of his friends, it was all a terrible, secondary pain. The only thing that mattered, the only thing that consumed his every waking thought, was Jasmine. He knew her. He knew their love. And he knew, with a certainty that was the only solid ground in his collapsing world, that she had not left him. Someone had taken her. His grief, his rage, and his profound sense of helplessness began to coalesce into a cold, methodical resolve. If the police were going to waste their time investigating him, then he would have to find her himself. The architect, the man who built things, would now have to become a demolitions expert. He would have to tear down the wall of lies and suspicion that had been built around him, and he would have to tear down the walls of the prison that held the woman he loved. His agony was not just a passive state of suffering. It was becoming the fuel for his own, desperate, and very personal investigation. For Detective Ben Holloway, the Jasmine Carter case had become a low-grade, persistent headache. In the first few weeks, it had been a high-profile, media-saturated nightmare. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the media attention had waned, and the case had settled into the familiar, frustrating rhythm of a dead end. He had done his job, as he saw it. He had followed the most logical line of inquiry. He had focused on the groom, Marcus Hayes. He had dug into the man's life, searching for a motive, for a crack in his perfect, polished facade. But he had found nothing. The man's alibi was solid. He was at the altar. His finances were in order. There was no secret girlfriend, no hidden life. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a successful, heartbroken young man. But Holloway's cynical, experienced mind refused to let go of its initial theory. The absence of evidence, he believed, was not evidence of innocence. It was just a sign of a very clever, very careful criminal. With no body, no crime scene, and no confession, his investigation had stalled. The case file for Jasmine Carter, once a top priority, was relegated to a lower and lower position in the teetering stack of files on his desk. The city's relentless tide of violence had brought in a fresh wave of homicides, of armed robberies, of cases with clear victims and tangible evidence. He had to focus his resources where they could do the most good. A few months after the disappearance, he made the official call. He downgraded the Jasmine Carter case from a suspicious missing person to a voluntary missing person. It was a quiet, bureaucratic decision, made with the stroke of a pen on a form. But it was a decision with profound consequences. It effectively ended any active, large-scale investigation. The case was now a ghost, a file that would be stored in the cold case archives, to be looked at only if some new, miraculous piece of evidence were to fall from the sky. He had a brief, unpleasant phone call with Gloria Carter, informing her of the change in status. Her reaction was a predictable explosion of rage and grief. She had accused him of incompetence, of laziness, of not caring about her daughter. He had listened, his expression impassive, and had ended the call with the same hollow promise to keep her informed. He knew, on some level, that he was taking the easy way out, but he justified it to himself with the cold, hard logic of his profession. He was a detective in a city that was at war with itself. He had to be a general, deploying his limited troops to the battles he thought he could win. The Jasmine Carter case, in his professional assessment, was an unwinnable battle, and so, Jasmine Carter became another ghost in the system. Her smiling face on the missing persons flyer would remain pinned to the bulletin board in the squad room for a few more months. A sad, silent accusation that Holloway learned to ignore. And then one day, it would be taken down to make room for a new face, a new ghost. The system, in its weary, overwhelmed, and deeply flawed way, had done what it was designed to do. It had moved on. Inside the cramped, suffocating confines of the trailer, Jasmine Carter was engaged in a silent, high-stakes, and deeply personal war. Her captor, Adrian Finch, had successfully stripped her of her freedom, her family, and her future. But the one thing he could not touch, the one thing she guarded with a fierce, desperate jealousy, was her mind. And she began to use that mind, the sharp, empathetic, and analytical mind of a social worker, as her primary tool for survival. She understood, from her training and from her own terrifying first-hand experience, that Adrian was not a simple, brutish criminal. He was a man living in a profound and profoundly dangerous state of delusion. To fight him with logic, to confront him with the reality of his crime, would be to shatter his fragile, narcissistic world, an act that would almost certainly provoke a violent and potentially fatal reaction. And so, she made a conscious, strategic decision to enter his delusion. She began to play the role he had cast for her, the role of the rescued damsel, the grateful, adoring partner in his twisted, romantic fantasy. It was the most difficult and most nauseating performance of her life. She began to engage him in conversation, her questions carefully crafted to map the strange, labyrinthine corridors of his mind. She learned to speak his language, the language of a shared, secret destiny, of a love that the outside world was too blind to understand. "Tell me again about the first time you saw me," she would ask, her voice a soft, compliant whisper as he brought her a meager meal of canned soup and stale bread. And he would launch into his story, his eyes alight with a fervent, almost religious zeal. He would describe the coffee shop where she had worked in college, the way the light had caught her hair, the exact moment he had known that she was the one. He spoke of Marcus not as a rival, but as a temporary, misguided obstacle that he, the hero of the story, had been destined to overcome. With each conversation, Jasmine was gathering data. She was creating a detailed, psychological profile of her captor. She learned his triggers, the topics that would agitate him and send him into a sullen, menacing silence. She learned his vanities, the small, pathetic ways he needed his own genius, his own specialness, to be validated. She learned the rhythms of his life, the predictable, routine nature of his comings and goings. This was more than just a survival tactic. It was an act of intellectual defiance. While he thought he was indoctrinating her into his world, she was, in fact, studying him, analyzing him, like a scientist observing a particularly venomous and particularly predictable specimen. She held on to her own identity in the silent, secret spaces of her own mind. At night, when he was gone, she would lie on her thin mattress and she would perform a mental ritual. She would recite her wedding vows, the beautiful, powerful words she had never gotten the chance to say out loud. She would hold a detailed, imaginary conversation with Marcus, telling him about her day, about the small things she had learned, about her unwavering, absolute belief that he was looking for her. She would talk to her mother, feeling the comforting, imagined strength of her presence. Her mind became her sanctuary, a place of order, of logic, of love, in a world that was defined by chaos and obsession. It was the one part of her that remained free, the one part of her that Adrian Finch could never, ever touch. It was in this secret, internal world that she was not a victim, but a strategist, a social worker engaged in the most difficult and most important case of her entire life, her own. For Marcus Hayes, the months after the wedding were a long, slow, and agonizing education in the nature of helplessness. The police had all but abandoned the search, their focus remaining stubbornly and insultingly fixed on him. His own life was in a state of freefall, his career in shambles, His friendships strained under the weight of an unspoken, terrible suspicion. He was trapped in a nightmare from which there seemed to be no waking. But in the midst of the despair, a single, powerful conviction held him together: his absolute, unshakable faith in Jasmine. He knew she had not run away. He knew she was in trouble, and he knew that he was the only one who was truly looking for her. His architect's mind, a mind trained to see patterns, to analyze systems, to find solutions to complex structural problems, began to apply itself to the most complex and most painful problem of his life. He transformed his and Jasmine's apartment into a makeshift investigation headquarters. The walls of his study, once covered in elegant architectural drawings, were now a chaotic collage of maps of New Orleans, wedding guest lists, vendor contracts, and timelines of the day she had disappeared. He went over every detail, again and again, searching for an anomaly, for a single discordant note in the otherwise perfect symphony of their wedding plans. He interviewed the caterers, the florist, the organist, his questions precise, methodical, and desperate. But every conversation was a dead end. Everyone remembered a beautiful, happy bride, a perfect day that had ended in an inexplicable, tragic mystery. The one detail that he kept returning to, the one that felt like a small, sharp stone in his shoe, was the videographer, Adrian Finch. He pulled the contract he had signed with the man. It was a standard, boilerplate agreement. The business address was just a P.O. box. The phone number was a prepaid cell phone. There was nothing unusual, nothing overtly suspicious, but it was the man himself that Marcus couldn't get out of his head. He remembered meeting him, just once, a few weeks before the wedding. He had been quiet, awkward, and had refused to make eye contact. At the time, Marcus had dismissed it as the shyness of a creative, artistic type. But now, in the harsh, unforgiving light of the tragedy, the memory felt different. He remembered the man's eyes, the brief, fleeting moments when they had glanced at Jasmine. There had been an intensity there, a focused, proprietary gaze that had felt, even then, slightly unsettling. It was a feeling, not a fact. It was a hunch, a piece of intuition that he knew the police would dismiss as the desperate grasping of a grieving fiancé. But it was the only thing he had. It was the only thread in the entire, tangled mess that felt loose, that felt like it might, if pulled, unravel something. He tried to learn more about Adrian Finch. He searched online, but the man had almost no digital footprint. A simple, template-based website with a few generic wedding videos. No social media. No personal history. He was a ghost. The more Marcus dug, the more the unsettling feeling grew into a full-blown, nagging suspicion. The man was too anonymous, too clean, too invisible. He sat in his study late one night, staring at the wall of evidence, at the smiling picture of Jasmine that was the centerpiece of his chaotic investigation. He looked at her happy, trusting face, and then he looked at the signed contract for Adrian Finch. It was a long shot. It was a desperate, almost nonsensical leap of logic. But it was the only leap he had left to take. In a case with no evidence, a single, nagging detail, a memory of an intense, unsettling gaze, was about to become the fulcrum upon which the entire investigation would turn. Adrian Finch's world was a small, perfectly controlled ecosystem of delusion. The trailer, hidden away on a desolate, rural lot, was his sanctuary, the place where his twisted fantasy life was made real. He had created a bizarre, grotesque parody of domestic life. He would bring Jasmine gifts: cheap, plastic jewelry, wilted flowers, romance novels he had stolen from a local thrift store. He would talk to her for hours about their future, about the small, isolated house they would one day build together, a place where the corrupt, outside world could never touch them. His belief in his own narrative was absolute. He saw Jasmine's fear, her quiet, withdrawn compliance, not as a symptom of her trauma, but as a sign of her slow, inevitable acceptance of her new reality. He believed he was winning her over, that his love was so powerful, so pure, that it would eventually erase the memory of her old life. This profound, unshakable delusion was the source of his arrogance. He had committed the perfect crime. He had taken the woman he loved from under the very noses of her family, her friends, and her fiancé. He had sat in the church, a silent, invisible observer, and had watched the beautiful, satisfying chaos he had created. He had even spoken to the police, his performance of the concerned, professional vendor so flawless that they had never given him a second thought. He believed he was intellectually superior to everyone, to the grieving mother, to the heartbroken groom, and especially to the slow, stupid, and incompetent police. He had outsmarted them all. This belief in his own genius made him careless. He saw no need to cover his tracks, because in his mind, there were no tracks to cover. He kept the van he had used in the abduction, parked in its usual spot at his apartment complex. He kept the video camera, the tapes from the wedding, a treasured, personal souvenir of his greatest triumph. He made no effort to change his appearance or his routine. Why should he? No one was looking for him. The world was looking for a runaway bride or for a guilty groom. The world was looking in the wrong direction, and that was a source of constant, private, and deeply satisfying amusement for him. His fatal flaw was his complete and total underestimation of the two people who were, in fact, still looking. He saw Gloria Carter as a hysterical, grieving woman whose pain was a testament to his own power. He saw Marcus Hayes as a pathetic, defeated rival, a man who had been outsmarted and outmaneuvered. He could not conceive that their love for Jasmine was a force that was as powerful and as obsessive as his own twisted delusion. He was so confident in the strength of the walls of his secret world that he never imagined that someone, on the outside, was already looking for the key. His arrogance, the very thing that had allowed him to commit his crime, was slowly and inexorably setting the stage for his own downfall. After 6 months of hitting nothing but brick walls, of being dismissed by the police and pitied by his friends, Marcus Hayes knew he had reached the end of his own abilities. His grief and his intellect were not enough. He needed help. He needed a professional. He took the small, nagging suspicion he had about the videographer, and he walked into the cluttered, slightly seedy office of a private investigator named Frank Guidry. Guidry was a man in his late 50s, a former NOPD detective who had left the force under a cloud of cynicism and had set up his own small one-man operation. He was not a glamorous figure. He was a grinder, a man who knew the city's underbelly, who knew how to find the information that didn't show up in official reports. Marcus laid out the whole story, his voice a low, tired monotone. He told Guidry about Jasmine, about their perfect day, about her impossible disappearance, and then he told him about Adrian Finch, about the unsettling feeling, about the man's strange, intense gaze, about his almost complete lack of a personal history. Guidry listened, his expression a mask of professional skepticism. He had seen 100 grieving spouses, boyfriends, and fiancés in his long, weary career. They were almost always looking for a villain, for a simple answer to a complex, painful story. The quiet, weird videographer was an easy target for a desperate man's suspicion. "Son, I'll be honest with you," Guidry said when Marcus had finished, his voice a gravelly, smoke-cured rumble. "It sounds like a long shot, a big one. The cops have already looked at this. They think she ran, and usually, they're right. They're wrong this time," Marcus said, his voice quiet but firm, his gaze unwavering. "I know they are. I know her. I'm not asking you to find a killer. I'm just asking you to find out who this man Island. I'll pay you whatever it takes. Just look into him, please." There was something in Marcus's eyes, a raw, desperate sincerity, a quiet, unshakable conviction that moved the old, cynical PI. He saw not a potential suspect, but a man who was utterly and completely devoted to the woman he had lost. "All right, son," Guidry sighed, stubbing out his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. "I'll take the case. I'll do a deep dive on your video guy. But I'm not making any promises." The turning point was not a dramatic, sudden event. It was a slow, methodical grind, the kind of patient, unglamorous investigative work that Guidry excelled at. He started with the basics, running a deep background check on Adrian Finch. What he found was a whole lot of nothing. The man had paid for everything in cash, had no credit history, and had moved every few years. He was a ghost, a man who seemed to have a deep, professional aversion to leaving a paper trail. This, for Guidry, was the first red flag. In the modern world, Only people with something to hide were this invisible. Then, Guidry started on the physical legwork. He began to canvass the area around the St. Louis Cathedral, looking for something the police had missed. He knew that in a city as saturated with surveillance as New Orleans, there were always more cameras than the ones on the official list. He spent days talking to hotel managers, to security guards, to shop owners. And finally, he found it. A small boutique hotel on a side street, directly across from the alleyway where Jasmine had last been seen. The hotel had a single, high-mounted security camera that pointed towards the street. A camera the NOPD, in their hurried initial investigation, had completely overlooked. The hotel's security system was an old analog tape-based one. The manager, a grumpy, overworked man, reluctantly agreed to let Guidry look at the tapes from 6 months ago, after a significant amount of cash had been exchanged. The turning point was about to be found, not in a brilliant deduction, but in the grainy, black-and-white footage of a forgotten security camera. The back room of the hotel was small, dusty, and smelled of stale coffee. Frank Guidry and Marcus Hayes sat side by side in front of an old flickering monitor, the air thick with a tense, almost unbearable anticipation. They were watching the security tape from 6 months ago, a silent, ghostly, black-and-white recording of a day that had started with so much promise and had ended in an abyss of unknowing. The quality was poor. The angle was high, but the camera's view of the alleyway next to the cathedral was clear. They fast-forwarded through hours of footage, a silent, sped-up ballet of ordinary city life. Then, Guidry slowed the tape to real time. At 2:57 p.m., the image they had been searching for appeared. A woman in a brilliant white wedding dress, her figure a radiant, ghostly presence in the grainy footage. It was Jasmine. She was followed out of the side door of the church by a man carrying a large camera. Adrian Finch. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He was watching a ghost. He was watching the last recorded moments of his fiancé's freedom. They watched as Finch gestured for Jasmine to stand against the far wall. They saw her turn her back to him, a happy, trusting bride posing for a picture that would never be taken. And then they saw it. The man, Finch, did not raise his camera. He put it down. He reached for something on his belt. The footage was too grainy to see what it was, but they saw him lunge forward. They saw Jasmine's body go suddenly, unnaturally rigid, and then slump to the ground. A raw, guttural sound of pure, animalistic rage and grief escaped Marcus's lips. It was not a runaway bride. It was not a case of cold feet. It was a violent, brutal, and premeditated abduction. It was everything he had known in his heart, now laid bare in the stark, undeniable truth of the video footage. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. They watched, their faces grim, as Finch dragged Jasmine's limp body into the back of a dark-colored van that had been parked in the alley. He closed the doors, and then, in an act of such cold, calculated arrogance it was almost unbelievable, he walked back to the side door of the cathedral and, after looking around to make sure no one was watching, he slipped back inside. He went back in, Marcus whispered, his voice a mixture of horror and dawning, furious comprehension. He went back into the church. Guidry fast-forwarded the tape. They watched the alleyway. They watched as the chaos began to spill out of the church, as the panicked wedding party began their frantic search. They watched as the police arrived. They watched the sun go down. The dark-colored van, with Jasmine presumably inside, never moved. They kept watching. Hours passed, and then, long after the police had left, long after the wedding guests had been sent home, in the quiet, pre-dawn hours of the next day, the tape showed the side door of the church opening one last time. Adrian Finch slipped out, got into the driver's seat of the van, and quietly drove away. They had it. The camera, the silent, impartial, and all-seeing witness, did not lie. He had lured her out. He had taken her. And then he had gone back inside and had sat in the church, a predator hiding in plain sight, watching the heartbreak and the chaos he had so meticulously and so monstrously created. The alibi he had so carefully constructed was a lie. The timeline he had given the police was a lie. Everything was a lie. And they had the proof. The meeting with Detective Ben Holloway was a scene of quiet, professional, and deeply personal reckoning. Marcus Hayes and Frank Guidry sat in Holloway's small, cluttered office, the grainy security footage playing on a laptop on the desk between them. They did not speak. They let the silent, black and white images tell the story. Holloway watched, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes betrayed the storm of emotions that was raging within him. He saw the abduction. He saw the videographer, the man he had interviewed and had dismissed as a harmless vendor, slip back into the church. He saw the van, sitting in the alley for hours, a silent, mobile prison that had been just a few hundred feet away from him and his entire investigative team. When the footage was over, a long, heavy silence filled the room. Holloway did not make excuses. He did not get defensive. He simply looked at Marcus, and for the first time in the 6 months since his life had been shattered, Marcus saw not a cynical, dismissive cop, but a man who was confronting the catastrophic, soul-crushing weight of his own failure. "I was wrong," Holloway said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "I was wrong, and I am so sorry." The apology, as inadequate as it was a start. But Marcus was not there for apologies. He was there for action. The case, which had been a cold, dead file for months, was instantly and explosively reactivated. The full, formidable resources of the New Orleans Police Department were now focused on a single target, Adrian Finch. The investigation moved with a stunning, almost terrifying speed. They had a name, they had a face, and now they had a crime. A team of detectives was dispatched to Finch's last known address, a rundown apartment complex in a quiet suburb, but he was gone. He had cleared out the apartment weeks ago, leaving no forwarding address. He was a ghost again, but he had made one final, arrogant, and fatal mistake. He had kept the prepaid cell phone he had used to book his videography jobs. He likely saw it as a dead end, a disposable, untraceable tool of his trade. But in the 6 months since the abduction, cell phone technology, and the technology used to track it, had made a quantum leap. A team of tech experts from the department's cybercrimes unit was brought in. They worked through the night, using the latest cell tower triangulation technology to try and get a lock on the phone's location. The phone was off, but they knew that if he ever turned it on, for even a few seconds they would have him. For 2 agonizing days, there was nothing. And then, on a Tuesday morning, they got a hit. A single, fleeting ping from a cell tower in a remote rural area just outside of Baton Rouge. It was only on for a few seconds, just long enough for Finch to check his voicemail, but it was enough. They had a location. A small 3-mile radius in the heart of the Louisiana swampland. The unraveling, after months of agonizing slowness, was now happening at a breakneck speed. Satellite images of the area were pulled. They showed a desolate landscape of swamps and wooded lots. And on one of those lots, almost completely hidden by a thick canopy of cypress trees, was a single, small, and isolated travel trailer. It was a needle in a haystack, and they had just found it. The hunt for Adrian Finch and the desperate, frantic search for Jasmine Carter was about to come to its final, violent conclusion. The raid was a swift, silent, and overwhelming display of force. In the hazy, pre-dawn light, a convoy of unmarked police cars and a heavily armed SWAT team descended on the isolated, rural lot outside Baton Rouge. They moved with a quiet, lethal precision, surrounding the small, dilapidated travel trailer that was hidden in a grove of cypress trees, a place that felt like the end of the world. From a command post a few hundred yards away, Detective Holloway, Marcus Hayes, and Gloria Carter watched on a grainy, live feed monitor from a tactical drone that hovered, almost silently, in the sky above. For Marcus and Gloria, it was a moment of almost unbearable, heart-stopping terror. After 6 months of a desperate, agonizing search, the answer, for better or for worse, was inside that small metal box. The SWAT team, on Holloway's command, breached the door with a battering ram, the explosive sound of violent, percussive shock in the quiet, misty morning. They flooded into the trailer, their weapons drawn, their shouts of, "Police, show me your hands," a cacophony of controlled, professional violence. Adrian Finch was caught completely by surprise. They found him in the small kitchenette, in the middle of making a cup of coffee, his face a mask of pure, shocked disbelief. His meticulously controlled, secret world had been shattered in an instant. He surrendered without a fight, a pathetic, trembling figure who seemed to shrink in the presence of the heavily armed officers. The monster, without his shield of invisibility, was just a man. And then, one of the officers kicked open the locked door to the small bedroom at the back of the trailer. And there, huddled on a thin, filthy mattress, was a woman. She was pale, impossibly thin, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, disbelieving hope. It was Jasmine. She was alive. The words crackled over the police radio, a message that was a pure, unadulterated miracle. "We have the victim. She's alive. I repeat, the victim is alive and safe." In the command post, a single, collective, and cathartic sob of pure, explosive relief erupted from Gloria and Marcus. The 6 months of hell, of not knowing, of fearing the absolute worst, was over. The reunion was not a media spectacle. It was a quiet, sacred, and profoundly emotional moment in the sterile, brightly lit triage room of a local hospital. When Marcus and Gloria walked in, they saw Jasmine, a fragile, bird-like creature who was a ghost of the vibrant, joyful woman they remembered. But as she looked up and saw them, her eyes, which had been filled with a deep, ancient sorrow, suddenly lit up with a spark of the old, familiar light. They rushed to her bedside, their hands reaching for her, as if to confirm that she was real, that she was not a dream. Marcus held her hand, his tears falling, unchecked, onto their clasped fingers. Gloria stroked her daughter's matted hair, her own sobs silent, racking shakes. Jasmine's voice, when she spoke, was a dry, raspy whisper. She looked at Marcus, the man she was supposed to have married, the man whose loyalty had never, for a single moment, wavered. "You found me," she whispered, the words a simple, powerful, and absolute statement of faith. "I never stopped looking," he choked out, his voice thick with an emotion that was a lifetime in the making. The whispers and the suspicions of the community were silenced forever, replaced by a sense of awe at the unwavering, heroic devotion of a man who had been so wrongly and so publicly judged. The police narrative of the runaway bride was shattered, replaced by the horrifying and ultimately triumphant story of a woman who had been stolen and a family whose love had brought her home. The abductor, the quiet, unassuming man with the camera, was exposed. He had sat among them, a predator disguised as a witness, a monster hiding in the most sacred and most public of places. But in the end, his cleverness, his arrogance, had been no match for the simple, powerful, and unbreakable truth of a love that had refused to be silenced. The vows, which had been interrupted, were now, in their own quiet and profound way, finally and beautifully renewed.